yourself, you always write for somebody else. That's something very difficult for some master thesis students to understand. But the point of a paper is to communicate what you have done. So the first thing to think about is who is that audience that I would like to address. And also different journals have different formats. So you should at least have some idea of which format you're going for. For example, you have a short report. Some journals have word limits, so you need to know. Yeah. So that's an obvious first one. So whenever you have suggestions or...
I think that also, like, if you know the journal that you're aiming for, even in terms of that, like, are there constraints on word limits and things like that, it will probably affect everything that you do going forward. Like, depending on when you've decided that, if you've run, say, 2 experiments and you're debating on whether or not you're going to do a third, if you're going to submit to a short report journal like Psych Science, then maybe you're less inclined to do so than if you're submitting to JEP General or something where those kind of multi-experiment papers are more the norm. And it seems like there's everyone just jump in whenever too, but like there's kind of an interaction between the decisions you make in the writing process and where you're going to ultimately put it to.
And it also makes me think of a conversation we had yesterday with Marco about, so you have the type of journal, but you also have the domain of the journal. Like for instance, it could be that you have a study on, so this was my first, on approach avoidance towards tobacco-related stimuli. So it could be like either in a general psychology journal, or in a health psychology journal, which are 2 different domains. And in my case, I don't really know health psychology journals. So at first we submit this kind of journal, and then we just realized that there are really implicit rules for this type of journal in terms of what are the most important things that you should put forward, more at the strategic level. So what should be the most important claim to put forward in the paper. And when you don't really know this kind of domain, then it's also good to talk about people who are experts in this kind of literature. So that's maybe a different question, but that's related to the kind of journal you want to submit your paper. If you have a paper that could go into different types of journals that could be interesting for different literature domains, then it might be good also to make sure that you know about this domain and the implicit rules that people have.
Yeah, if you go outside of your comfort zone, like to a journal you've never come to, I would always look for somebody who's familiar with the journal, either as a co-author or simply send the paper to that person just to have a check and say, okay, is this likely to make a chance in that journal or not? Because indeed there are a lot of implicit rules that are nowhere written down, and the only way to know them is to know people who are in the inside of that crowd. But on the other hand, I would never let the choice of a journal dominate what I do. If you really, you first have to know what you want to communicate. Of course, you need an audience, but never let a journal change what you want to say. Look for a journal that is suitable for what you want to say.
However, what if you could extend also the planning of the study, although in a kind of slightly different way, not one-to-one match, because probably sometimes you anticipate all this, even at the level of the planning of the study. Because just to make an example for the discussion, if you want to publish in content-based journal like health psychology, consumer psychology, whatever, they appreciate more stimuli or whatever it is with content as opposed to abstract. So if you have an abstract kind of stimuli, you already start with a disadvantage compared to, so if you want to publish an essay or behavior as opposed to something, behavioral responses on whatever in the lab. So I guess that there are some of these aspects could be considered even before you start to write at the level of the plan.
Again, here I would say that can definitely happen, and sometimes it's useful to think it that way. but I wouldn't let journals dominate the type of
No,
research.
that's what you consider.
Yeah.
Dominate, but consider.
Yeah. That is definitely the case. Sometimes if you submit to a journal, clinical journals will ask much more information about your samples, for example, whereas as an experimental psychologist, I would register hardly anything about my sample. And then you would have problems getting into certain journals if you can't say more about your sample. So yes, that.
I mean, you can also determine the amount of studies that you conduct. For instance, imagine that you run 3 studies and then you might want to stop there and to claim, to have a certain claim, but you can also conduct more studies to have more, I don't know, to test moderators or whatever, and then to argue something more, to have a more ambitious claim, and then, I mean, that could determine whether you go for JPSP or JET, and then, but you have to think, I mean, it also determines, like, if you have the aim to publish in JPSP, then you need to have something like, I don't know, 5 studies at least, so it also determines the amount of studies that you need for the paper. I would say it's something, it's kind of a circle, like you have some studies, you think, okay, I could stop there, I could continue, and then I could go for this journal, and so it means that I have to continue collecting data to have more studies, and it's something I guess you have to think during the data collection, during the...
Yeah. Yes, it's useful, but again, in my case, I tend to pay relatively little attention to that. I'm always happy to publish even in smaller journals if they offer me more freedom and more allow me to do what I want to do. But yeah, of course, for me, strategic things are not that important anymore.
Sure.
If you're an early career researcher, then it's more important to think about where you want to be seen and so on. But still, from a point of view of science and scientific integrity, these considerations, take them into account, but they shouldn't dominate.
Yeah.
The second before thing, because if we take S for every point, we're going to need more time even. So the second before thing is only start writing when you know what you will write. I see several of my PhD students and definitely master thesis students who say, okay, I'm going to start writing a paper, and then they are in front of an empty screen, and then the first sentence, and then half a day later they're still working on the first sentence. Definitely the first paragraph, basically. And in my case, typically I have the paper almost ready in my head. And I think that's not a good strategy for sleeping, but but sometimes in my head I think, okay, shall I do it that way? Shall I do it that way? And only if you feel like more or less confident about how you can write a paper, only then should you start, because starting from an empty page doesn't work.
But if this
just other ones.
Yeah, so that was the next one. That is start with an outline, and the outline we think of as a storyline, basically. So it should be a sequence of arguments that make sense. And Marina had a good suggestion that basically each paragraph can contain one argument, and that one argument you should be able to put in one sentence. So then a storyline is basically a series of sentences that make up your argument, that make up your story, and each sentence presents one argument. And if you have the feeling, there's more in the paragraph than I can summarize in one sentence, then basically this means that you have 2 arguments and that you have to split up. I have never thought of it that way, but that is what you...
Yeah. I mean, that's very useful. Even when you already wrote the paper, to go back to the introduction and to try for each paragraph to like visualize the sentence. Like, is it the case that here this paragraph has only one idea, only one? Is it the case that it could be summarized in one sentence? And if it can, then it's okay. But sometimes it makes you realize that the paragraph is actually more complex than it should be. So that's also useful in this direction, like to realize that the writing is not so good, it's not like fluent enough, it doesn't follow it's not logic. And then you can also realize that when you take a step back on your paragraph and you try to visualize this.
And then there's a difference between the storyline, having the storyline right, and what I meant with don't start writing until you know what you write. Because don't start writing, for me, especially the first couple of paragraphs, need to be really the words, and so how you are going to formulate it. The storyline is about the ideas. There needs to be a coherent story with the classical triangle shape, and you start off, and then you go into the specifics of your study. But what I meant with don't start writing before you know what you will write is also the sentences. If you have a good paragraph, first paragraph in your head, then you're off. It's like a push start, and then the rest follows.
Yeah. On that point, maybe it's worth saying as well, like for me at least, I often struggle to start papers. So I don't start at the introduction, I start at the methods, because the methods are very factual, straightforward. If you've pre-registered, you already have some material for it, and I personally find it a very, very useful way to like get the ball rolling rather than starting literally at the top and going, oh my god, because yeah, I've been that person looking at the cursor, like clicking, yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's nicer to at least go, well, the introduction section is empty, but I've got the methods there.
And it can, as you also said during our preparatory meeting, that it can be good if you're stuck in the introduction to go to the method section again, so that that's much easier and concrete to write.
Yeah.
And then we are up to things related to pre-registration and art scripts.
Well, that's, I mean, I think everyone does pre-registration differently. Some people like, I can't remember whether it was Julio or Daniela said, how do you say your name again? I'm so sorry. Daniela, see? Yeah, okay, sorry, I was like, did I say that wrong? You said like, that you prefer to use as predicted, or was that Julio who said it? It was Julio, sorry. Julio likes to use as predicted, and like he said, you know, he like puts in relevant details, but that it's kind of each individual section. That can also still be helpful. You can borrow that text. I personally prefer to use like a blank Word document and write my pre-registration as if it were a paper. So when I write my pre-registration, by the end I've got the outline of that argument of the introduction already written. I have the basic premises there. I have the method section basically completely written. All I have to do is go back and change it from the present tense to the past tense, or the future tense to the past tense. And the results section basically written too, in terms of like the preamble to like what analyses are you going to do. It's just a matter of basically sticking in some p-values afterwards. And before you know it then, you've written the pre-registration, run the study, now you get to writing the paper, but half of it's already written. And for me, I find that incredibly useful and motivating. There's no better feeling than like liking your past self. And I find also like if you pre-register like processing scripts, analysis scripts, the more work you do on the front end, which for some reason feels a lot easier, there's less weight on your shoulders, the less you have to do when you get to writing. And I don't know, I find that very, very freeing and helpful.
If I may, this implies an organization which is not up. I mean, it's not given.
Yeah.
You can kind of organization in terms of anticipating everything, as opposed to doing things when it's needed.
Sure.
So basically, you need to think about the analysis before you have the data.
Yeah.
You have to spend time before you start the experiment. So you need to plan ahead. Basically, it's as if you put your deadline, mental deadlines, are weeks ahead.
Yeah.
Of what you would do if you wouldn't do that stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's not obvious. If you are not used to it.
Yeah, indeed.
At the end, you don't have time to do it.
Yeah.
So you find yourself, how can I do it if you don't do it? What is the possibility?
Yeah.
You need to anticipate everything by 1 week, 2 weeks, sometimes you learn the details.
When Sean Hughes was still in the lab, he and I used to play Call of Duty online some evenings, and We would always talk about strategy because we got really into it. And Sean would often use this phrase, we need to be acting, not reacting. And I think that it's relevant here too. Like, you need to be acting in advance of what's going to happen rather than saying, oh, I've got data now, I got to, because all that's on top of everything else, you probably will make more mistakes or you'll overlook things because you're reacting to what's in front of you rather than being proactive and saying, well, I'm going to preempt most of this stuff in advance, and then when it gets here, if there are little mistakes, I can really easily spot them because all I need to focus on is spotting mistakes rather than doing the whole thing. So I think that acting rather than reacting is, especially as we increasingly do more preparatory work, is a really nice way to approach writing papers.
And it also forces you to minimize the amount of measures of like all the stuff that you can put in your study because I mean, you know that afterwards you will have to justify everything.
Yeah.
So if you think about the paper that you will write and how you will justify every step that you put in your experiment, then it helps you to also reduce the amount of
and that comes back to Michael, that even when you do your research, you have to think about the paper. That is indeed very important. You have to think about, okay, we do that a lot in Marine, that we say, okay, we have these studies, but you already think about, okay, that will be a paper, and that will be a paper. So because you know, okay, that's the message, and then you think about, okay, so to finalize this paper, you need an experiment for that, and that's a way to organize the studies. Yeah, pre-registrations. I think it can be helpful, of course. You said something about R scripts.
Yeah, also? True. Because when you run the study, so usually what you will do after running the study is it's just to analyze the data, right? So you first have this R script that is a bit messy, and then when you have to write the paper, well, you have to go back to this R script, and then at this stage, I think it's very useful to have a very clean R script because you know that after that you have to share this R script. So even for you, that's very useful to, at this stage, have something that is very clear. And as Jamie said, so it might be a good idea to start with writing the method and the results and having this very clean R script before maybe writing the introduction because you know that at this stage you have to like go back to everything, go back to all the results that you have and have a very clear picture of everything. And it can be also important because if, for instance, you go back to the literature when you write the introduction and then you realize that actually those people observed that and also I didn't observe that. I mean, the fact that you have all the results in mind when you go back to the literature can be also very important in some aspects. And so it's true for writing the introduction, but it's also true then for the data sharing. So it can be useful at this stage before writing the introduction to have something very.
Also, because like the more thoroughly you document something in advance, the better. Because we'll do it quick, we'll do it quick and dirty now, and we'll come back to it later. Yeah. Never happens. Never go back to it. And if you do, you always do it. You never do it the way that you would have done it had you done it properly the first time. There's more work involved in doing it quick and dirty, and then going back and trying to fix your mistakes rather than not making those mistakes in the first place. Yeah. Like that was definitely a mistake I made when I was early in my PhD, especially. Like I would. Like write an R script because I was still learning how to code in R, and then I'd be like, okay, well I'll just bash it out now and won't worry about style or documentation or anything, and then I'll come back to it and I'll fix that all later. They're still lying on OSF and they're a mess. Like I'm never going to go back to them, because it's just you have other things in mind. It's a lot of work. But on top of that, in the couple of instances where I have had to go back to those scripts, even years later, I've looked at them and I've been like, I don't know what I did, and that's like you have to really sit down and look at what all of the things, see what you've done. If you have a clear process of documenting code from the outset and clearly writing a pre-registration that does a lot of the work for you, you're never going to have that problem.
Can I ask you something? About how to be useful, especially at the early stage of the career, to approach this using a real systematic approach. When you are a PhD student, you have to prepare your research plan, you have to look at the literature. We are more or less experienced with reach the highest level we are playing in 3 months. Do you think it's really useful to start from the systematic review approach of the literature, or is it too narrow because then you have to select specific keywords and then you are not able to you are using this.
So I'm not sure I catch the question. So you mean you're talking about the literature review?
Yeah.
When you start as a PhD student?
Yeah, but starting with the systematic approach.
Yeah.
Not just, okay, for the keywords, but I follow the recruitment guidelines, I put my diagram, I took inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, just to get what the state of the art with the most updated methods for detailed research. Because I'm supervising one PhD student and we started this way, and I think it was very useful for him. But at the same time, it narrows your view because if you do a systematic review properly, then you may miss something important in your field that might against your vision and you may have new ideas. So if you are at the early stage of your career, you have to balance this out. I guess it's useful to do it in advance of your first paper. It could be your first paper, the systematic review of your
I've done that a couple of times with PhD students, but most often if we didn't know the field that well ourselves, and if there was no systematic review about those things, then you can write a systematic review as a first step in a PhD project, and you can publish that sometimes also. If you're really well versed in the domain, then I think it's easier to do without, because you can point your PhD student to the relevant paper, because you know the topic yourself very well. But sometimes it could also be that you think, okay, it's a nice topic for a review, but remember, even systematic review, they're quite time intensive. So the time investment has to weigh out, that disadvantage has to weigh up to the advantages of it. So it depends. If you think it could be useful for the literature in general to have a systematic review, and or if you're new to a field, then I would do it. I wouldn't do it always.
I think that there's also opportunity cost there, because imagine it's a student, you've no intention to publish a systematic review. The main pedagogical goal is to get the student up to date with the literature. They're acquiring two things at once. They're acquiring the knowledge of the literature, but they're also acquiring the skill of doing systematic review. That takes time. What else could they be doing instead? Well, they could be learning how to use R, they could be learning about R Markdown, GitHub, Open Science Framework. There's all of those things. So like I would say also, it's like, what are the pedagogical goals? Like, what do you want at the end of it? Do you want the student to know how to do a systematic review? If so, cool. But if not, and it's really about getting them updated with the literature, probably, yeah, you can refine those like key papers for them, or do it like a bit more qualitatively, maybe even a bit together. But yeah, the systematic review is a big time sink, especially if it's a big field. So I guess it sort of depends, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also hard to read a large amount of paper without having a goal. Like if your goal is to like run an experiment, like you have a big idea of the experiment, you want to manipulate that and that, you're not sure. Like when you read papers, you know, I mean, you have a goal, like to confirm this kind of experiment or not, or to write a review of the literature. But if you're reading a lot of papers without having a goal, without knowing like having something in mind, like when you do that, I don't know. It's just hard to remember everything. It's just hard to take notes and not knowing what to note, basically. I don't know.
And also, if it's a new domain for me, like now recently, what Marina and I started was impression formation. I didn't know that well, and Marina did it better than me. But then I always try to involve an expert also, somebody who does know the literature. Just as it doesn't always work, but can be helpful.
Maybe that's the happy medium then between not locking yourself into that by doing a systematic review, but also having the freedom to come up with new ideas too.
So those were the before things. So just to summarize, think about the audience and the journal beforehand, perhaps even when you're already doing your research. If you have good pre-registrations, that will also help you to write your paper. Art scripts will help you, very precise art scripts will help you write the paper. Start with an outline, a storyline, and then only start writing if you already have some sentences in your mind. The 5 before things. Then we have a lot of during things. Let me see whether I can, well, I'll just start from the first thing that Jamie said was kill your children. Be willing to kill your children.
Yes, not literally, but I got to explain what that means now. For me, at least, when I write, that sentence is always popping up in my head because someone said it to me years ago, and I can't remember who. But like to not get attached to specific sentences just because they feel nice or they've got a nice quality to them. Like be willing to get rid of, be ruthless basically, and get rid of sentences that are you're maybe trying to save. So I always hear "kill your children" in my head. Maybe it says more about me than it does about the writing process.
But it is important, it relates to the main aim of writing. You're never, again, you're not writing for yourself, you're writing for your audience. So you might have a sentence you like very much, but if this doesn't help you communicate what you want to communicate, then you should get rid of it. And I think one of the best experiences I ever had as a writing paper was I had this paper on the semantic Simon effect, and it had 5 studies in there, and it was like, I guess 30 pages long or something like that. And the reviewer said, okay, make it 2,000 words short with 4,000. So I had to reduce it from 10,000 words to 2,000 words. And amazingly, you can do it. If a reviewer forces you to reduce the length of your paper dramatically, you'll be surprised how much you can get rid of. And since then, I always had this thing in my head, like, yeah, you can reduce this further. You can get rid of the ballasts, the superfluous things, and there's a lot. You're always surprised how much you can delete, and that's very much also a kill your children thing, because there can be points in there that you think, oh, that's a really good point. I want. But if it's not, if it detracts from your main message, you must be willing to delete it.
Also because it doesn't help the reader. You know, it's kind of selfish to want to hold on to sentences or ideas that don't fit with the flow of the paper because the reader won't benefit from it.
And they often say less is more, but writing papers is an area where that applies. Less is more.
Allow me to share. I had experienced this with an economist many years ago. We wrote something together. Basically, this point, what I was thinking, what should I cut? This point, what should I keep? So the frame of mind was, why should I keep this? Is it really essential? No. Should I cut this? Because your frame of mind is in terms of just or having something, as opposed to trying to cut something. It's easier to keep your chin.
That's so true. I recently had that with the learning in genetic learning paper. So we had with Sean a paper on learning in genetic learning basically. And so that was you had to explain what learning is and then apply it to genetic learning. And that was like 40 pages or something like that. And then we turned it around and said, okay, learning in different systems. So not just genetic, but also in groups and in robots and so on, so in all of these systems. And then I really had that exercise to say, okay, what do I really need? Not what do I want, and in the end, that paper when I submitted it the first time, it was like a third shorter than the original one, but with applied in all these different areas. So again, also that attitude of saying, what do I really need? And that's really tough.
Yeah.
Because then you have like these really nice, almost arguments developed in a paper and say, no, don't need this for this paper. And you have to let it go. So that's an important one. Killing and less is more. The next one is near the end of the writing. It's better to have an imperfect paper, so a paper that is not perfect but submitted, than to aim for a perfect paper. That's also an important one because many PhD students I've had, they keep working on a paper and keep working and keep working, and then after like some weeks you ask, okay, yeah, but, and they cannot give it to you.
Yeah.
So they want to continue to work on it, and at some point you have to give it to somebody else.
I think that's, yeah, I mean, also just more generally, like writing a paper is an iterative process, like whether it's passing it off to a co-author or passing it off to review or publishing it online to try to get public comments. Like a paper is, if you let it be, it's a living document and it can grow and develop, and it doesn't have to just be birthed and arrive and stay like that forever. And yeah, I think that's part of Kill Your Children as well, right? It's like allow it to be fluid, allow it to grow, don't get attached to it, and let others give you feedback.
Yeah, it will never be perfect. If you submit it to a journal, well, there's one thing you can be certain of: there will be reviewers saying this is not good and that is not good. So you can never completely preempt all of the possible reactions of reviewers. It's impossible. Sometimes you have to say, okay, this is good enough for me now. Then check with your co-authors, of course. Sometimes, if you're uncertain, check with some colleagues. Or recently, people have been doing preprints. So you put your preprint on Psych Archives and invite comments for 4 weeks or something like that, and use this. I haven't done this because I'm not. Preprints also have a risk because I've written many papers where the original version, I'm happy that nobody has seen them. So that's what my problem with preprints. Sometimes it can be too early also to show it to the world, but it can be helpful. What I used to do is send it to good colleagues and ask for comments, and they would send papers to me who asked for comments. But then it was you know who has read the drafts. I'm not because I'm scared that people will run away with ideas, but simply as a safety that you don't get embarrassed later on for what you have put on the internet.
It also doesn't have to be like you do it with all papers or none either. Like if there's one that you feel is further along in the process, I've seen plenty of people, they even put like cover pages on the manuscripts they upload that says, you know, this paper is a work in progress, we're posting this for public feedback. And yeah, it's an option, you know.
Yeah, I think it's simply a personality thing. If you're promotion focused or prevention focused, progress and more maintenance, progress, promotion, and maintenance. Anyway, yeah. So that's another one. Then one that I find very important. Yeah. One that I find very important because that's how I learned to write papers. My first papers I simply modeled on existing papers. So you learn from observing how other people do it. My first papers were on the Stroop effect, and then I basically read a bunch of papers on the Stroop effect and tried to emulate that. It's really like write in that same style, just as you would emulate somebody's tics or in a theater, you would do a performance while you look at how other people behave and you mimic that behavior. And that's the same thing for writing papers, I think. Because every group of researchers also has their own types of peculiarities. So you basically mimic what other people are doing. Of course, not copy. And the best way to avoid copying is never to write. I tell it to my students, you never write with a paper next to you. So if you do that, then
On the point of papers that are never finished, and continue, how would you deal with new research that comes up as you're writing a paper? Is it best to include it? Is it
yes.
Because you weren't considering it while you collected your data? What's the best way to approach that?
Well, I've had papers where we came across similar papers being published, and then we basically said, look, this was designed, or while after we collected the data, we discovered this and that paper. And then so if you frame it truthfully, of course, then you can say, look, then it's positive to see that this similarity or striking differences in that way. So then you, like with everything, I would just be open.
Yeah. I think that's one of those, like, academics often form implicit rules without a lot of direct contact with consequences, and like one of them has been like there's often an avoidance of being honest about some things in papers, like just being upfront and saying, yeah, this came out after we did this, or we didn't know about it. And when you are open, I think people are really receptive to it, in my experience at least.
And related to what you just said, I'm not sure whether you want to talk about that, but so when you read papers in your field, it's one way to understand the implicit rules of how to talk about this effect, how people usually, what kind of terms people use, and so on. But so that's one way to know how to write papers. Another way, I think it's also another important thing is to have maybe more formalized information about how to write papers. And if you want to have some formalized information on that, I remember when I was a PhD student, when I just started my thesis, my advisor offered me a book which is called Write It Up by Paul Silva. I don't know if you know this guy, but it's a really nice book, and it basically tells you how to write a paper and how, like, it formalizes the structure of a paper. It explains, like, very formally what is a paper and how we should write a paper and some tips about writing. And that also helps, I think, to know these rules, like, explicitly, and then to identify these elements in papers that you read. I think it's important to have both, to see many examples of papers, to infer what are the rules of papers, and then also to have this formal information on these rules, like to have them very explicitly written in a document. I think those are important.
It's almost as you have. You can learn via rules, or you can learn via instances.
Yeah.
So it is the two. Books can be good to make things explicit, but I would say the real knowledge is in being exposed to the examples and training it yourself. And that brings us to the next point, because you said that Silva said, write every day.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an advice that I always keep in mind is to write every day. It's always the case that you have to write something, and if you just take an hour every day, an hour and a half, to write your paper, then it's very useful because you don't have the time to forget what you did the day before, and an hour and a half is enough just to go back to the paper and to write a bit. It's enough to progress, and it's not too much to get bored. The main point is just that you don't have to take like 30 minutes to go back to what you did the last time that you went to the document because you just worked the day before on the same document. Then just a gain of time, like it's incredible to work this way.
But here I take a different approach because for me it takes at least half a day before I'm into writing again. So I cannot write for 1.5 hours.
Because you didn't work on the document the day
No,
before.
even if I work on it the day before, I need time to get, and that's what I call the zone. And once you're in the zone, you can really, it slows out. You can sometimes write half a paper in one day if you want.
Yeah, but I think that the two are not excluded. Like it could be that you just work an hour and you're not so motivated, but the day after you are in the zone, and then you spend 3 hours working on the manuscript, and it doesn't mean that you have to stop if you are.
Yeah, I often have the experience that one day I'm in the zone, and the next there's hardly any sentence I can get on the paper. So it's really, it's a special place.
But I think that for you, that comes with having so many exemplars of experience that you kind of can better discriminate what a good writing day is going to look like. And you also have the exemplars of knowing that you can write those papers.
It's to say there's no thing that is good for everybody. Everybody has their own strategy, and you have to more or less learn that if, like me, you find out that working on writing only 1 hour or 1.5 hours on a day, if that's not good for you, don't do it. Then take longer periods. But I get the argument of Marine, it can get really boring, unless you're in the zone.
When I was writing my PhD, I just made an agreement with myself that I would write 100 words per day. And it wasn't that I would stop then, and it wasn't that I would necessarily do a single word more, but just that at the end of the day, even if the next day I would start by killing all my children and just getting rid of all of it, I would write 100 words every day. And at least that way it kept me in front of the Word document. It stopped me from feeling avoidant towards it. It kept me on task, and that was very helpful, especially for bigger writing tasks.
Yeah, but I think that's the main point. It's to be non-avoidant about writing, because I think most people are anxious about writing, at least at the beginning. So it's just to force you to write and to trick you to write every day.
Especially when you're starting out.
Yeah,
because that was the point related to the writing every day. It is also a skill. So everybody that I've supervised that had to learn how to write. So in the beginning it's much more difficult. And you get better.
Yeah. Just like riding a bike as well.
And I mean, as a PhD student or postdoc, you can have 1 hour and a half dedicated to writing. But if you take the average, if you are taking that as a PhD student, have the habit of writing every day or something, and then after, when you don't have time, but you will make room for writing this day.
Yeah. It's also like, when you, I don't know, you don't drive often, and you get into the car for the first time in like a month, and you just have that moment where you're like, all right, how do I do this again? You're just like, okay, yeah. And even more so if you say like, go to Belgium and drive on the other side of the road, and you have to be like, okay, I just need a second to reorient myself here. If you do it every day, you never have that moment. Especially if you're tight for time, if you can manage to keep doing it every day, then there's fewer entry costs when you do sit down to try to do it more intensely.
When you can, physically can
do
that every day.
The next point on our list is storytelling. That's very difficult to explain, I think, but it's something you have to aim for. And it's again related to writing for an audience. Think always of the audience who you're writing, and some people have the gift to write in an engaging way. They're really telling a story that you can engage in. But it is, there are two things to it. First of all, whatever you write, it is always a story. It's never the truth, or it's always some spin you are making, and some message you want to bring across. So this story, that's really important to know what is your story. Because if you don't know what your story is, the reader will also not know what your story is. So that's one thing. And the second thing is to do this in an engaging way. And that's really, I think, yeah, a gift.
Yeah.
Some people have the gift to write in an engaging way, but you should aim for it, and that's relate. Of course, without it becoming prosa, we are not writing books here, we're not writing novels, but still it's good to be engaging. And that relates to our next point, is that I have mercy on the reader. So remember that your reader is not ideal. That's a person that has to do many other things, and he or she wants to get your message with as little effort as possible. So this means that not only do you have to be clear, but also use simple words. That's a point that Jamie made. Don't use overly elaborate language. Just put it as plainly, as simple as you can. It's often better than trying to show that you can use difficult words.
And to be rewarded.
Yeah, yeah.
That's,
yeah, there was that paper that showed recently that papers that are written more simply get like twice the number of citations than more complex ones, because as it turns out, things that are easier to understand get referenced more. I think also even just for like your own happiness with yourself. I mean, I was saying to the guys at lunch there that like I look back on the first paper that I wrote. I went back to it recently and read it, and I was cringing at myself because like you just get these big, long, complex sentences that I just, it sounds like you're trying to seem smart instead of trying to convey a message, and it doesn't benefit anybody.
And I think that when you are kind of forced to use these complex words is usually because what you're saying is like is wrong. Like basically it's just you're trying to find an escape somewhere by using very complex words. It's what you're
Sorry.
Yeah?
I was just going to say, I think there is some research on that as well.
Yeah?
Something to do with, like people's own comprehension of ideas is like better when they can explain the things more simply.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, I guess.
Yeah.
There is no one from philosophy.
No,
that's also philosophers.
Except for Wittgenstein, but he's an exception.
And then the next point related is always reread from the perspective of the reader. That have mercy on the reader. The reader needs to be able to understand what you've written, not you. It should be obvious that you understand what you've written, which is also not always the case. But the main aim is that somebody else needs to understand it. So, and that's a really good writing skill, is to be able to switch perspectives and take the perspective of the reader. That's what I often try to do when I give feedback on papers from my collaborators. I always take the perspective of the reader. Is this clear for a reader? Do you really have to say that? Should you not emphasize that more? The reader is likely to miss that point. Those types of considerations.
Yeah. It's why I say that first writing and give more comment, give an example, because we have feedback from someone that is always because when you're writing, you're having in the paper that someone else.
Yeah.
And when you write, even your own thoughts, you see mistakes that maybe you write do.
Yeah. And you can learn a lot from others.
It's also related to that, like writing as a skill, because if you are learning a skill and you're never getting feedback, reinforcement, or punishment, then you're never going to improve. It's So I guess it's, yeah, don't be afraid of the feedback either. Like you were saying before, Jan, some PhDs will like sit on papers for weeks and get stuck on something rather than saying like, yeah, so the paper's basically done except for this section, and this section. Can you give me comments? And it moves it forward for everybody then.
Yeah. And that brings us to the next point. What I also find important, if you're stuck, so you're stuck on a sentence, we all know this, right? 10 times the same sentence. I just stand up and go do something else. Because if you're blocked on a sentence, it will not come. You need to get away, get your mind on something else. And if you return, it's likely that the sentence flows out. So don't sit in front of the screen when you're stuck. Know the literature, write, and then go back to the literature.
Yeah, I think that's also related to what we discussed before with Daniele about the literature review. It's just that when you have to write the introduction, then it's very unlikely that you know everything about the literature. Like you bring some parts of the literature, and then you try to write something, and then you need to go back to the literature to check this point, and then you write again, and then you go back to the literature. I mean, it's always like that you have to go back to the literature when you are writing. You cannot know everything before writing, and that's also, so that's related to the point that when you read a paper, you need to have a goal. If you don't have a goal, that's very unlikely that you will remember this aspect, this very specific aspect of the paper. Like, you will remember those because you were looking for this information, for this specific information. So it's normal to go back to the paper, to one paper like 3, 4 times, 5 times. You always go back to the same papers, and that's normal because you look for a very specific information that you could not remember for the previous reading. So you need to go back to the literature, right? That's a circle. And circle.
Yeah, I mean, like it's an iterative process, right?
Yeah.
So those are during comments.
Do you also use some kind of implicit algorithms in the way you are writing the introduction or discussion, for instance, or methods? There are all kind of standards, especially in the clinical field, console and so on. But also, when you think of introduction, there is a statement about the issue, the problem, why the problem is important, maybe a hint of your direction in the paper, why this direction is related to another way of solving the problem. So, use this kind of algorithms, or is more like intuitively writing?
I always think of the story. Does it have a head and tail? And that's you're describing possible storylines, yeah? And often probably I'll never think explicitly about it in that way. But of course, maybe it might be useful in the beginning. I've written enough papers now, I think, to do it, to have probably that knowledge implicitly, to use it. But maybe at the beginning, yeah. That would be in the books then. The storyline, books about how to write.
Yeah, I guess.
We'll have those algorithms, those
I think if you do all of the other stuff we've talked about, it actually will come naturally too. Like if you're perspective taking for the reader, then you're naturally going to be reflexive in what you're writing, and you're going to be linking back what you're going to do with what's already been done, because you're going to be thinking, well, the reader needs to know this. So I think it kind of falls under that.
Yeah, and I guess the story, I mean, it could be that for some papers you have several storylines that you could adopt. For instance, I'm thinking about the parent-based neural effect, right? So we adopted a certain perspective on the paper, like, but we could have adopted another strategy, a more mechanistic strategy, more, I don't know, oriented on evaluative conditioning, for instance. So, but this is a choice that we made. Also, so regarding like what message we wanted to convey in the paper, And also, I guess, related to the journal, we wanted to set, like, so we had a target, not only reading, but that also, that fits well with the journal we chose. But I guess that if we have, for instance, in our case, if we get rejected and if we have to look for another journal and so on, the storyline can also be adapted and it can also change a bit. Not drastically, of course, but like the angle you take to tell your story. Is it from like a mechanistic perspective, from a more descriptive perspective? It has to be adjusted also regarding the type of journal, regarding the like many aspects. But I think that's good also to have this. To make maybe explicit a bit all of these storylines you could have. This way you can see all of them and you can select the one that you think is the more adapted to the message you want to convey and to the journal you want to submit to. Right?
Yeah, I agree. It's good to be mindful of the other stories that you could tell, and at least make a conscious choice for why you've chosen one over another.
Exactly. What is the most important message?
Also, because it could end up that a reviewer asks you, well, you could also say this, why didn't you say that?
And that brings me to a point I've just added, of course, because that the review process is also part of the writing. You submit something, but then you have the reviewers come back to you. And just to reassure you, I'm still always devastated when I read reviews and action letters, and I'm wanting to pull them through the internet and punch them.
Kill their children.
But I've learned that reviewers are always right, even when they're wrong. Because that's, I think, one of the main skills I've acquired during my career, that is to respond to the comments of reviewers, to see what is really, what they are really wanting to say, and try to understand why they are saying what they're saying. Because sometimes they can have, if they don't understand you, this means that you haven't been clear.
Yeah.
So that even the mistakes are pointers for improving your papers. And that's something that I can say that I've learned over the years, and that's a very important skill. Not only to get it published, but it really makes your paper better.
Yeah.
So reviewers are always right, even when they're wrong.
Yeah. Oh, let's say 99%. You can find situations in everyone's situation. Just think on the side of the review and so on. And I think another question is, even if the reviewer is right, sometimes the editor might not be right. In the sense of, to sentire, perhaps again, once again, it will be, I think you make a very important point that is, don't think that you're right.
Yeah.
Pick up what other people are saying. Yeah, I don't think that I would push it to the point of saying that always is an overclaim, but
as a rule of thumb. As a rule of thumb.
As a rule of thumb, saying I like that most often.
I think that thinking of it in that way as well will probably preempt something you guys are going to talk about after the coffee break, which is if you by default assume the reviewer is right, then when you do want to rebut something they've said, it helps you choose your battles a lot more. Because if you're going to reply to a reviewer and be a bit combative and say we disagree, it's better to do it about like one or two things max rather than half of the things the reviewer said. You're like, no, disagree with that, disagree with that, disagree with that. So it's better to at least
unless you have reached the point of no return.
Sure.
Sometimes with reviewers you can say, okay, this is a lost case. I'm going to try to convince that reviewer, and then you can be combative. But remain friendly, of course. Don't do an Urishima. So, and then other after things, so that's after you finished, I finished the paper. Well, the first point is you never finish the paper. So paper is always a living document. And this is with new journals are going to evolve in that direction. So paper is not an end product. It is also not the main product. The main product will become the data. You see that now that journals, the funding agencies and so on, they're emphasizing the data as the main product of research, and your paper is just like an advertisement for the data, which means that you have to foresee also the future. How can my data be reused, for example? And even papers, you often have different versions of a paper, so you see that papers have been changed even after they have been accepted.
Yeah.
It will become more and more common that papers become living documents that are changed, and you get them cross-marking or something else.
Cross-ref, yeah.
That you have a link somewhere on your paper which shows you all the previous versions that there have been, and then you can check all the changes in the paper is more and more, it will not become the main product or the end product of your research.
I wonder, there is already one problem that we start to deal with. Wonder how this problem is dealt with in Belgium. No, the main particular data, say the permission to use the data by the participants is given all the permission. And now there are all kinds of ethical committees that are telling you data cannot be reused again unless you ask the initial participant that somebody could have used, which is in a complete conflict with European science and kind of data as a problem. So he said, as far as the prevention is concerned,
yeah,
you know how this is.
Yes, we have debates with that, and people don't have rights over anonymized data. So if you have anonymized data where you cannot retrace this to a specific person, of course, there's a lot of debates about when you can and cannot retrace data to a person. But if it is anonymous, the person has no right over it.
Even if he or she consents to, because that's not, for instance, military absolutely not.
Yeah.
Just taking the opposite.
No, in Belgium it was said that so legally they have no rights over it. What we have done in our ethical committee is make the informed consent, say that we will store and reuse anonymized data. So you can put it in your consent form that you will anonymize the data and then make them available for reuse.
Against me, not people are bypassing this issue because still they are the beginning. So there is kind of gray area. It also means that the consensus has to be specific, cannot be tested. So, which means you cannot ask this will be reanalyzed, you have to say in what country.
No. This is the case for when there are personal data involved. If all personal data have been reviewed, there's no issue.
That's the way in which it's done. But is university or in Belgium?
This was advised by us by the official instance of the privacy committee. So they told us you don't need to worry about it as soon as they are done.
I think that it's neither we can have this option depending on specific. I had this experience where if you don't make the data available, you have to specify in the consent if people are allowed to keep the data as reusable, but not to be archived. So it's committees, the one that ask you to add this part in the consent. Participants may agree to the fact that the data will be reused without knowing the exact purpose. And that's what you mean. That was valid.
Because I know,
so I think it depends on the specific.
Because I stopped by my part, the example was suppose somebody uses your data to do a publication, a version publication, something which is complete against your beliefs and whatever. You couldn't give this data if you were to do this. So how do you do this? But this was, I don't know. So it seems that this
could be done, but it depends on, I guess it depends on the specific ethics board that you have chosen. I have this experience.
I think, I mean, there is also research, it might be a bit of a non-issue in terms of participants themselves. I think there's some work that shows that overwhelmingly research participants are like expect and are happy with the fact that their data will be reused and shared. I think that most people consider it almost like an obligation, you know, ethically speaking, because if a researcher does some research with public money, then the public should have access to that data in anonymized form. And I don't know of any cases that have ever been brought, aside from issues of like ineffective anonymization where you have like a very specific patient population that are identifiable because they have a rare condition, and if you know that they're a 36-year-old woman from Antwerp, then it's just Mary and nobody else. But in terms of that general, like with experimental studies, I don't know of any issues that anyone's ever raised, you know?
That's the thing. The lawyers don't know themselves because it will depend on jurisdiction, I know you say.
Predicates.
So when the first law cases, those will determine what GDPR actually implies. Because if a rule judges in this way, then this will become a precedent on which you can orient yourself. Until now, there haven't been any lawsuits on this, so they can only say, in my opinion, this is the interpretation of the law. But the interpretation needs to be given by a judge.
Because what is happens when we around the GDPR data, which is a European level, it's not a national level. So when we literally say an interpretation that can just the European Union could have some level for interpretations in other countries. Part of the union because they know it's at the European level.
Yes.
So it's there to know the interpretation. It's interpretation which to me makes perfect sense.
But
it was not interpretation. I heard even claims like for any new analysis, you have to ask for another kind of consent for the
Then you have to stop doing research. Then you have to stop doing research.
I fully agree, but that's what I heard.
But that's what even the lawyers are also sensitive for, is this balance between public rights and private rights.
you also get into like strange positions where you say, well, what if I have a simulated data set which is simulated from the variance covariance matrix and the means that I got from the real data set? Am I allowed to share that or not? And I mean, you will get to positions where people say, no, you can't share that, even though it's a simulated data set, completely synthetic, purely based on parameter values from the other real data. So,
okay, but we are digressing a bit.
Yes, sorry.
The topic. So basically, we reached the end of our list. There is one item that I had on there, which is let your paper write a bit, because I've rarely had a paper that I reread and thought, well, this is really good. Because always, whenever you reread things you've written, you always think of ways to improve it. Of course, it doesn't mean at some point you have to let go. That's the case. But it can help to distance yourself from the paper and then reread it with a fresh pair of eyes. So that's the end of our list. What I'll do is I'll put this in a Word document and then put this in the Dropbox. Are there any other issues? Because it has become more of a monologue than a dialogue. Because we thought we couldn't fill 1.5 hours with this, but we more or less did. So, are there issues you want to discuss?
What's the role in the future, especially of AI writing? Because now we can already have support for grammar correction, which is okay. Starting to have support for the methodological part, sometimes uses that we can starting point for writing methods.
Well,
we know that we can also have context.
There was actually a paper that was recently submitted for peer review, which was written.
How? I mean, it could be useful.
Yeah, if it's good, why?
Is there a problem?
What would be the problem?
Or if the AI is trained on a data set based on your old writing, does that constitute plagiarism? I mean, those are questions people are asking.
Sorry, so the data set is...
It's like the AI is trained on your old papers, so the only piece of information the AI has is what you've written in the past, and it produces new text, which is solely based on...
time and...
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
So, but yeah, then people
I
will
would
ask.
say yes.
Yeah, but I mean,
It will be a super fast writing, but also.
I'm gonna say like for me personally, I think there's too much stuff going on that's actually happening now, and I'll wait until it becomes something to be a problem, and then we can talk about it. But it's like you can't predict the future, and you know, I don't know, like that would be my take on it. Like I'm anxious enough about everything else that's actually happening. I know.
Yeah, trying to think about potential issue with that.
I have one more question. It's of course sensitive. When PhD students write a paper and the PhD student and supervisor are having different stories in mind for the storyline, what is the solution? I don't know, what is the way?
Like 2 papers.
What's your goal? Like, is the goal to teach the student how to write? Is it to?
Not necessarily. Yeah, not necessarily in order that the students have difficulties in writing. It's more like, okay, there are different stories. Like in a way, the supervisor see a different thing. Like maybe the reviewers see a different thing. Not on design, on
Narrative.
on the narrative, on the story.
Also for narrative, you can build a case. You can say this is a good narrative because this and that and that. And the other narrative is not as good because of this and that and that. So my first attempt would be to reason it out and present arguments and say, I like this because of that and I dislike that because of that. If you don't come to an agreement then I would ask a third person maybe. Of course, yeah, it's difficult to know when you always have your own preferences, but there's of course always the fact that the supervisor typically has more experience and could anticipate better what the reaction of readers would be. So I don't think it's I don't think I don't think that as such that's a sufficient argument, but then the supervisor should be able to give additional arguments for why a narrative is good based on his or her experience in the past.
I think you can also take it as like if the student really isn't budging and they're really stuck on a particular narrative, like especially if it's from their project, I think it's good to like give autonomy on that. And if you, as the supervisor, think no, it's not the right line to take, then let them experience the consequences of taking the wrong line. Like let them get the reviewer feedback and say, I told you that they would say this, they've said it, and
I've been, as a supervisor, I've been wrong also. That I thought, no, we shouldn't submit to that journal or not with that storyline. And then eventually they did it and it was accepted. So it's not that because you're an experienced supervisor that you're always right. It's simply a matter of, providing arguments for it.
yeah. And like the balance between exploring and
exploring. And indeed, so I can now think of several cases where I said, okay, if you want to do this, do it. But that's of course that becomes more difficult the more you own the project as a supervisor. If it's like on a ground project, a ground you have written and you have hired somebody, you probably have goals and ideas, and then it's more difficult to give autonomy to the research.
But that's also another argument that you can make in that context, right? You can say, look, this needs to be part of this project, the narrative needs to be in line with that, it's blah, 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 blah.